My daughter-in-law snatched the menu right out of my hands with a sharp yank and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Toothless old people only eat soup. You won't be choosing anything tonight. She delivered the verdict in front of the entire table with that shrill voice she always uses when she wants to humiliate someone in public. I am Beatrice. I am 71 years old, and throughout my entire life, I have earned the righteous reputation of telling truths straight to the face, without sugarcoating or anesthesia. But what Stephanie didn't know, as I lowered my gaze to the immaculate tablecloth, was that the commercial lease for the property where she had just opened her luxurious clinic was resting at the bottom of my desk, entirely and exclusively in my name. It was a Tuesday afternoon when this whole farce began. I remember perfectly the sunlight filtering through the lace curtains that dressed the main living room of our house. I was sitting in my reading chair with a contemporary history book on my lap and a half-finished cup of black tea. Arthur, my husband, was dozing on the sofa across from me. Ever since he suffered that mild stroke 2 years ago, his afternoons have become slower, quieter. His physical frailty has forced me to be twice as strong, twice as firm against the world. I have always been a woman of character. I worked 40 years as a librarian at the State University, dealing with arrogant students, absent-minded professors, and miserable budgets that required an iron grip to manage. I learned very early in the halls of that institution that if you don't speak clearly and defend your space, the world will run you over without asking permission. That is why my relationship with my son Sebastian was always honest, sometimes bordering on crude. I didn't raise a man to be lied to. Sebastian was my pride, a hardworking, intelligent boy who had managed to build a solid career as an architect based on sheer effort and sleepless nights. However, that entire structure of values I instilled in him seemed to collapse the day he brought Stephanie to our house for the first time. From the very first second she crossed the threshold, I knew exactly what kind of woman she was. I didn't need more than 5 minutes of conversation to read her like one of my books in the cataloging section. Stephanie was a woman built on appearances, on expensive brands, paid on credit, on fake smiles and boundless ambitions that didn't match her actual talent. I never kept quiet about what I thought of her, and that, of course, drew a permanent line of fire between us. I told Sebastian, looking him dead in the eye in this very room 5 years ago. That woman is going to squeeze you for your last dime. She will pull you away from your roots, and when you are empty, she will leave you for someone with a fatter wallet. He called me dramatic. He indignantly asked me to give her a chance, and out of the profound love I have for my son, I tried to bite my tongue, an unnatural and painful act for me. That Tuesday, when I answered the phone, Sebastian's voice sounded tense, rushed, like someone walking on eggshells. "Mom, Stephanie wants us to go to dinner this Friday to celebrate the opening of her new aesthetics clinic. Please say yes. And please, Mom, try to be nice this time." Hearing my 35-year-old son beg me not to cause trouble turned my stomach. I didn't cause trouble out of thin air. I pointed out the uncomfortable truths they preferred to sweep under the rug of their supposed success. But I looked at Arthur, who had opened his eyes at the ringing of the phone, and he was watching me with that gentle, melancholic gaze he's had lately. He missed Sebastian. His face lit up every time our son walked through the door. So swallowing my pride and suppressing a sigh of frustration, I answered in my driest, most pragmatic tone. "We will be there at 8 at night. Send the address and we will be there." The week dragged on with the suffocating heaviness of a storm that announces itself on the horizon but refuses to break. I knew perfectly well that this dinner wasn't an act of kindness or a genuine desire to share her joy with the family. Stephanie didn't make a move without an angle. If she invited us, it was to show off, to rub her triumph in our faces. Her highly anticipated aesthetics clinic. A clinic that, ironically, was located in the most exclusive outdoor mall in the northern part of the city. A massive commercial building my late father had left me over 3 decades ago, and which I had kept an absolute secret. I always managed it through a ghost real estate agency to prevent Sebastian from losing his personal drive by knowing he was heir to a fortune, or worse, to keep women like Stephanie from getting their claws on our family wealth. Sebastian knew I had some savings and a decent pension, but I never gave him the details of my real estate. And I certainly never told him that the immense 2-story property his wife had leased with such blind pride was in the unchangeable city records, the exclusive property of Beatrice Navarro. Friday night arrived, carrying an unusually biting cold for the time of year. I stood before the full-length mirror in our bedroom, carefully studying the lines of my face and the posture of my shoulders. I don't wear heavy makeup. I have never liked the idea of hiding the passage of time as if it were something to be ashamed of. I put on a burgundy wool dress, impeccably tailored, sober but supremely elegant. An authentic pearl necklace I inherited from my mother completed the outfit. I didn't need to shine like a cheap chandelier to command respect. I went to the bathroom to help Arthur. He was struggling with the small buttons of his white shirt, his knuckles swollen from arthritis trembling slightly under the fluorescent light. I stepped closer in silence, gently brushed his hands away, and began buttoning the garment for him, adjusting the collar with precision. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," B. Arthur muttered, looking at me through the mirror with tired, watery eyes. "I know you can't stand her. I know every time you see her, you end up with a headache. I am going for Sebastian, Arthur, and because under no circumstances am I going to give that little woman the satisfaction of saying her in-laws are a couple of bitter old fools who refuse to support their son," I answered firmly, smoothing the lapels of his suit jacket. "Besides, if I let you go alone, she is fully capable of talking you into signing a blank check to buy another laser machine." Arthur offered a crooked smile, weak but genuine. He knew my dark humor, my direct way of handling anxiety, and my protective instinct over him. "Just promise me you won't fight with her today in the middle of the restaurant." Sebastian looked very stressed the last time he visited us. He has dark circles under his eyes. I finished fixing his tie, grabbed him by the shoulders, and looked dead into his eyes. "I never start the fights, Arthur. I only make sure to finish them." The cab ride to the restaurant was thick and silent. I watched the city's neon lights blur against the glass, wet from a fine, persistent drizzle. My mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour, calculating every possible scenario. I was determined to maintain absolute composure. I had made up my mind to be a block of ice, polite, distant, and above all, unbreakable. No matter what venomous jab Stephanie threw, I would simply look down at her from my moral high ground and change the subject. That was my containment plan. The restaurant she had chosen for the occasion was called L'Étoile Noire, an insufferably pretentious place in the heart of the financial district, famous in magazines for serving microscopic portions of deconstructed food on gigantic plates at borderline criminal prices. From the moment we pushed through the heavy glass doors, the atmosphere felt suffocating. The lighting was so absurdly dim, you could barely make out the faces of the diners at neighboring tables. And the background music was a constant electronic hum that drilled right into your temples. The host, a haughty young man wearing a suit that looked 2 sizes too small, looked us up and down, calculating the cost of our clothes before leading us through a maze of shadowy tables. Sebastian and Stephanie were already seated at a secluded table, strategically placed near a massive window overlooking the main avenue. Stephanie was wearing an emerald silk dress that exposed entirely too much skin for the freezing weather outside, showing off a diamond necklace that Sebastian would undoubtedly be paying off in installments for the next 3 years. Seeing us approach the woman didn't make the slightest effort to stand up out of respect for her elderly in-laws. She merely raised a nearly empty glass of red wine and flashed that rehearsed, hollow smile that always gave me heartburn. "Well, I thought you two got lost on the way. I was just about to ask the kitchen to prep some baby food and bring out the walkers," Stephanie said by way of greeting without lowering her voice. Sebastian stood up quickly, visibly uncomfortable, pale under the dim light, and stepped forward to hug us awkwardly. "Mom, Dad, so glad you made it. Traffic must have been terrible with this rain." "We arrived exactly at 8 o'clock sharp, Sebastian, just as we agreed on the phone," I replied, my tone completely neutral and stripped of any inflection as I pulled away from his embrace, gently but firmly. Punctuality is a basic virtue I haven't lost over the years, unlike certain modern habits. I sat in the cushioned chair across from Stephanie, first helping Arthur settle in beside me. The silence at the round table turned dense almost immediately, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Stephanie idly played with the long stem of her crystal glass, looking at me with a toxic cocktail of fake pity and open contempt. I kept my back perfectly straight, locking my eyes onto hers without blinking once. I am a direct woman. I am not intimidated in the slightest by the cheap arrogance of a social climber with delusions of grandeur. So Beatrice, she began dragging out the syllables of my name, as if it exhausted her to pronounce it. "What do you think of the place?" "It's highly exclusive. We had to use my connections and book 4 weeks in advance to get this window table. Of course, I suppose you prefer those noisy neighborhood diners, where they serve greasy stew and the floor is always sticky." Arthur cleared his throat beside me, shifting nervously in his seat. I didn't break eye contact. "The place is remarkably dark, Stephanie. I suppose the gloom helps hide the lack of imagination in the wall decor. But if you two enjoy paying triple to eat in the dark and pretend that's sophistication, who am I to judge your financial decisions?" Sebastian jumped in, sweating cold, wiping a cloth napkin across his forehead. Okay. We're here today to celebrate good things. Stephanie's clinic is already a massive success. We haven't even opened to the general public, and our VIP client list is fully booked for the next 2 months. "That's right, sweetheart," she added, puffing out her chest and touching my son's arm with possessiveness. "The space we secured is absolutely perfect, in the best outdoor mall in the city. It was incredibly expensive, of course. The security deposit nearly drained us. But the quality of the space is worth it. The owner of the building must be loaded with old money. Though the real estate director told me she's a bitter old recluse who never shows her face or deals with tenants. Better that way, honestly. I have zero patience for dealing with decrepit old women giving me orders on how to paint my own walls." I felt an icy whip of pure adrenaline travel down my spine. If she only knew. If she only had a fraction of a brain to look up the full name listed on the final page of the commercial lease her lawyer had blindly signed. But I said absolutely nothing. I let my silence settle on the table like a block of granite. The irony of the situation was so delicious, so perfect, that I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling a macabre smile. That was when the waiter assigned to us approached the table. A young kid no older than 22, holding a black notepad with a kind, attentive expression that entirely clashed with the metallic coldness of the place. He handed out the menus with precise movements. They were massive, heavy binders, bound in a synthetic material that crudely imitated leather. I took my menu and reached into my handbag for my reading glasses. I placed them slowly on the bridge of my nose. I opened the heavy binder, and the light from the centerpiece candle illuminated the pages. The font was ridiculously tiny. I calmly began scanning the options on the right side where the meats were listed. I was craving a good cut of beef, something substantial and strong to counteract the bitter taste left in my mouth by my daughter-in-law's company. "I'll have the smoked salmon with capers and the citrus reduction," Sebastian announced, trying to sound casual and worldly. For me, the warm lobster salad, and tell the sommelier to bring another bottle of this Merlot, but from the previous vintage, Stephanie ordered, slamming her menu shut and handing it to the young man. I kept reading my menu carefully. "I think I'll go with the ribeye, medium rare, with a side of asparagus," I commented aloud, speaking to Arthur without looking at the others. "What do you want my old man do? Are you in the mood for some soft grilled fish?" Arthur nodded slowly, squinting as he tried to decipher his own menu. "Yes, Bee. The white fish sounds good for my stomach." I never got to hear if Arthur was going to add anything else about his side dish. Before I could even blink or process the movement, Stephanie's jeweled hand shot across the table like the claw of a bird of prey. She grabbed the top edge of my open menu and yanked it toward her chest with a brutal, sudden force, tearing the leather right out from between my fingers. The motion was so violent and reckless that my water glass wobbled dangerously, spilling cold drops onto the tablecloth. I sat completely paralyzed, my hands still suspended in the air in the exact position they were in holding the menu seconds before. I raised my eyes very slowly, feeling the air around me drop 10 degrees all at once. Stephanie held my menu against her chest, wearing a frozen smile on her red-painted lips, a smirk of malicious triumph that disfigured whatever beauty she might have had. "Toothless old people only eat soup." "You won't be choosing anything tonight," she delivered the verdict, her voice ringing out, clear, sharp, and venomous. Not just at our table, but reaching the adjacent ones. The world seemed to stop, dead in its tracks. Time froze. The silence that followed her words was absolute and deafening. The young waiter, standing mere inches away, with his pen ready to write in his notepad, stood petrified, his eyes wide open, staring at Stephanie with obvious, genuine horror. Arthur let out a small, hoarse gasp of surprise, physically shrinking into his chair, as if the verbal slap had hit him right in the jaw. I turned my face slowly to the left, looking for my son Sebastian, the flesh of my flesh. The boy whose scraped knees I bandaged, whose architecture degree I paid for with overtime and sleepless nights cataloging dusty archives. The man I defended from the entire world, tooth and nail. Sebastian looked away instantly. He stared blankly at the folded white linen napkin on his lap and didn't say a single word. He didn't correct her. He didn't reprimand her. He didn't defend the woman who gave him life. His cowardly silence was a much deeper stab, much more lethal than Stephanie's crude humiliation. His muteness was the true betrayal. My primal instinct, forged in decades of not letting absolutely anyone walk all over me, screamed at me to stand up right then and there, to grab that glass of Merlot and throw it straight into the haughty face of that insolent little girl. To scream at the top of my lungs in front of the entire luxury restaurant that she was nothing but a pathetic gold digger. That the property she bragged so much about legally belonged to me, and that I could leave her out on the street with all her cheap Chinese laser machines tomorrow at dawn. The words burned in my throat sharp as butcher knives, ready to unleash a verbal massacre from which there would be no return. But then I looked at Arthur trembling slightly beside me, his eyes filled with an infinite sadness. I looked at the young waiter watching me with a mix of pity and empathy. And I looked back at my son, reduced to a useless, cowering spectator of his own mother's public humiliation. If I exploded in that moment, if I raised my voice, I would be immediately labeled the hysterical, jealous mother-in-law. I would be the crazy old woman ruining the beautiful celebration dinner of the perfect couple. I would hand Stephanie exactly what she wanted on a silver platter. The perfect excuse to play the victim, to cry crocodile tears, and alienate Sebastian from us forever, under the pretense that I was abusive. No. True fury. The kind of fury that actually destroys worlds and rips up roots doesn't make noise. It doesn't throw tantrums in expensive restaurants. It calculates in the shadows. It is served completely cold. I kept my gaze locked onto Stephanie's eyes. She glared back defiant, waiting for my explosion. She expected my indignant tears or my hysterical screaming. But I am Beatrice Navarro. I would not give her the immense pleasure of watching me break. I took a deep breath, unifying every scattered fragment of my dignity, and took my reading glasses off my face, folding them slowly with precise movements before placing them inside my purse, with a metallic click. I turned to the young waiter who was still paralyzed by the table. "Excuse me, young man," I said, my voice sounding as firm, serene, and clear as crystal, without a single tremor to betray the hell burning in my gut. "Bring me the soup of the day, please, and for my husband, the soft white fish he asked for." The boy nodded hurriedly, swallowing hard, visibly relieved to escape the suffocating tension of the table, and almost ran toward the swinging kitchen doors. Stephanie let out a small nasal giggle, satisfied and swollen with pride over her tactical victory. She had won the battle of the menu. She had proven in front of her husband, who held absolute power in this new family dynamic. Sebastian finally looked up from his lap, flashing a pathetic, trembling smile of relief, naively believing the storm had passed without casualties. "Thanks, Mom, for being so understanding today," my son murmured, rubbing his sweaty hands together. I didn't answer him. I didn't look at him once for the rest of the night. When the food arrived, the waiter placed a deep black ceramic bowl in front of me, containing a lackluster pumpkin broth. But in a swift, silent motion that escaped Stephanie's line of sight, the young man set down right next to my plate a small wicker basket covered with a napkin. Peeking out from under the cloth were 3 thick slices of rustic bread, warm and crusty, accompanied by a small ramekin of garlic butter. The waiter looked me in the eyes for a fraction of a second. He offered me the slightest nod, heavy with respect and solidarity, and walked away. A tiny act of human rebellion against cruelty. I picked up the silver spoon. The metal was cold against my lips. I dipped the spoon into the thick liquid and brought it to my mouth. I ate in absolute silence. Every movement of my arm was mechanical, rhythmic, precise. Around me, Stephanie and Sebastian resumed their trivial conversation. She exhaustingly recounted the details of the launch, the local guest list, the expensive laser equipment they had imported. "The lease we secured is for 5 years," she said, taking a long sip of her Merlot. "An absolute steal considering the location, on the main corner of the mall. I am going to transform that place into the most exclusive aesthetics empire in the entire city. Nobody is going to stop me." I swallowed another spoonful of soup, broke off a piece of the crusty bread the waiter gifted me, and brought it to my mouth. 5 years, I thought, chewing slowly. The standard contract my lawyer drafted had a very specific clause on page 4. A unilateral termination clause for direct owner necessity requiring the premises to be vacated within a maximum of 72 hours, paying an absurd financial penalty that I was more than happy to shell out. My graveyard silence unsettled Stephanie. I could tell by the way she was bouncing her leg under the table. She expected resistance, passive-aggressive comments. My sudden submission felt foreign to her, but her ego was so disproportionate that she quickly assumed I had definitely folded, that I had realized my pathetic place. Arthur beside me ate his fish with extreme slowness, shooting me terrified sideways glances. We had been married for over 40 years. He knew the vast and dangerous difference between my silence of defeat and my tactical silence. The latter was always the prelude to a devastating hurricane. Under the tablecloth, his trembling hand found mine and squeezed tight. I thanked him by returning the pressure with my firm fingers, but my face remained carved in stone. When we finished, I declined the dessert menu with a simple wave of my hand. Sebastian paid the exorbitant bill with his gold card. We stood up, I put on my coat, and we walked out into the cold street. The cab ride back was a dark, bitter reflection of the ride there. The drizzle had turned into a furious downpour that pounded the roof of the vehicle with a violent rhythm. "I'm sorry," B. Arthur whispered in the shadows of the back seat, squeezing my hand. What she said was unforgivable, and Sebastian. My God, Sebastian did nothing. Knowing that the pain of our son was tearing his soul apart, too, hardened my heart until it turned to steel. Sebastian made his final choice tonight, Arthur. I replied, staring out the window at the red traffic lights distorted by the rain. He chose his cowardice over respect for the woman who raised him, and she chose war. "What are you going to do?" my husband asked, his voice trembling with the anxiety of knowing me entirely too well. "I'm going to do what I always do when I find a rotting book contaminating the bookshelf," I muttered, my voice sounding raspy and lethal over the engine noise. "I'm going to take it out of circulation and throw it in the trash." We arrived at our house. The familiar smell of old wood wax and chamomile tea welcomed us like a safe haven. I helped Arthur take off his soaked coat. I patiently walked him to our bedroom. I helped him put on his pajamas and made sure he was comfortably tucked under the heavy blankets. I gave him a long kiss on his wrinkled forehead. "Get some rest, my old man. Close your eyes. Tomorrow will be a long day." I stepped out of the bedroom, closing the door soundlessly, and walked down the dark hallway until I reached the closed door of my personal study. I walked in and switched on the small green brass lamp resting on the oak desk. The yellow light illuminated the perfectly organized space, the walls lined with shelves packed with classic books. I walked straight to the old gray metal filing cabinet sitting in the corner of the room. I pulled out the tiny key I kept hidden in the false bottom of my pencil box. I unlocked the heavy padlock on the cabinet and pulled the bottom drawer until the rails squeaked softly. There, buried among old paid tax folders and Arthur's medical receipts, rested a thick, sealed manila envelope. I pulled it out with both hands, feeling the weight of the paper, and placed it on the polished surface of my desk. I unwound the red string keeping it closed and pulled out the stapled legal documents. The paper crinkled in the silence of the early morning. It bore the letterhead of the real estate agency, Gomez and Associates. The bold title read, "Commercial Lease Agreement. Property located at 450 Elm Street, Suite 12, ground floor and second floor." I scanned down to the section listing the involved parties. Absolute legal owner Beatrice Navarro. Commercial tenant Stephanie. I traced the pad of my index finger over my daughter-in-law's signature on the last page, drawn with a pretentious calligraphy, large and full of arrogant flourishes. She genuinely believed her glass world was perfect and safe. She believed she had humiliated a harmless, useless, resourceless old woman in front of her own son. I pictured her mocking face in the restaurant again. The violence with which she ripped the menu from my hands, the nasal giggle of victory, thinking she had tamed me forever. Toothless old people only eat soup. I repeated it in an icy whisper, letting the echo of her venomous words bounce off the book-lined walls of my study, feeding the cold fire of my resolve. I looked at the grandfather clock hanging on the wall across from me. It was 2 in the morning. It would still be several hours before the city woke up, but my mind had mapped out the master plan with the cold, millimeter precision of a surgeon about to amputate a gangrenous limb. I wasn't just going to evict her from my property. That would be too easy, too clean. I was going to make sure the fall was public, symmetrical, and absolutely devastating. I was going to destroy the very epicenter of her status. I didn't shed a single tear for my son's silent betrayal, nor for my daughter-in-law's open cruelty. There was no room left for useless sentimentality in my chest. They had crossed the one line I never allowed anyone to cross, and they had done it trampling on my dignity. I left the lease agreement open on the desk. I turned off the brass lamp and sat in total darkness to wait for dawn, knowing exactly who I would call the second the sun touched my window to blow Stephanie's perfect world sky high. Dawn arrived with an exasperating slowness, staining the sky a metallic gray that promised more rain. I hadn't slept a wink all night. I stayed sitting in my study chair, back straight and hands folded in my lap, listening to the relentless tick-tock of the grandfather clock. At 6 in the morning, when the first pale ray of sunlight filtered through the blinds, I stood up. My joints protested with a dull pop, a physical reminder of my 71 years. But my mind was sharper and more awake than ever. I went to the kitchen, turned on the coffee maker, and brewed a pot of thick, bitter black coffee, exactly how I needed it. While the aroma of roasted coffee filled the house, I prepared breakfast for Arthur. I cut 2 slices of sourdough bread, toasted them to a perfect golden brown, and spread a thin layer of peach marmalade over them. I poured his chamomile tea into his favorite thick ceramic mug and carried everything on a wooden tray to our bedroom. Arthur was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hands. Seeing me walk in, he gave me a tired smile that failed to hide the worry creasing his forehead. "You're dressed to go out," my husband noted, taking in my dark gray wool tailored suit and my perfectly polished low-heeled shoes. "I have an urgent errand to run downtown, Arthur," I replied in a calm voice, setting the tray on his lap. "Eat all your toast, please, and don't stand up too fast. Remember what the doctor said about your morning dizziness." "Bea," he started to say, his voice shaking slightly, "please tell me you're not going to do something crazy. Last night was awful, but Sebastian is our son. If you do something against that woman, we will lose him forever." I stopped in the doorframe, adjusting the belt of my black trench coat. I looked at him with a mix of infinite tenderness and unbreakable resolve. We already lost our son, Arthur. We lost him the moment he bowed his head and let his wife trample me in public. I'm not going to do anything crazy. I am simply going to put things in their proper place, using the exact same legal tools they signed. Eat your breakfast and rest. I will be back before noon. I walked out of the house, and the freezing morning air hit my face like a necessary slap. I walked to the main avenue and raised my hand to hail a cab. The morning traffic was already clogging the streets, a sea of red taillights and roaring engines crawling at a snail's pace. I gave the driver the address of the corporate tower that housed the offices of Gomez and Associates, the law firm and real estate brokers that had handled my family's affairs for 3 generations. I settled into the back seat, opened my black leather purse, and ran my fingers over the rough surface of the manila envelope holding the lease. Every detail was calculated. I am a methodical woman. My entire life among university archives taught me that a well-drafted document has more destructive power than a whole army, if you know exactly when and how to present it. I arrived at the imposing glass building at 8:15 in the morning. I rode the silent elevator to the 15th floor. The doors opened to a white marble reception area, where a young secretary in designer glasses looked at me with a raised eyebrow, clearly judging the austerity of my clothes amidst so much corporate luxury. "Good morning. I am looking for Arthur Gomez. Tell him Beatrice Navarro is here, and I don't have time to wait in the lobby," I said, placing both hands on the reception desk with an authority that left no room for debate. The girl blinked, startled by my direct tone, and quickly picked up the phone. Less than a minute later, the heavy oak door in the main hallway opened, and Mr. Gomez appeared. He was a man in his late 60s, in an impeccable suit, with thinning hair and a shrewd gaze he had inherited from his father. The man who helped mine buy the original plot of land decades ago. "Beatrice, what a highly unusual surprise. Come in, please," Gomez said, stepping aside and extending a hand toward his office. I walked into the massive office, steeped in the smell of expensive leather and furniture wax. I sat in the chair across from his mahogany desk without waiting to be offered. He closed the door, took a seat across from me, and folded his hands on the desk, observing me with professional curiosity. "You don't usually come in person, Beatrice. We normally handle everything via certified mail or quick phone calls. Did something happen with this month's transfers? Your tenants' deposits are all up to date." I opened my purse, pulled out the manila envelope, extracted the contract, and slid it across the polished surface of the desk until it rested right under his nose. "I didn't come to talk about ordinary transfers, Arthur. I came to execute Clause 4, Section B, of the lease corresponding to Suite 12 of the Elm Street Commercial Center." Gomez frowned, pulled a pair of reading glasses from his vest pocket, and looked at the document. He immediately recognized the lease for the new aesthetics clinic. He read in silence for a few seconds before looking up at me, genuinely bewildered. "Beatrice, this lease was just signed a couple of months ago. The tenant, Mrs. Stephanie..." He paused, looking for her last name on the paper, but I cut him off. "I know perfectly well who the tenant is, Arthur. She is my son's wife, my daughter-in-law." The lawyer's eyes went wide. He leaned back slowly in his leather chair, processing the information with the caution of a man who knows a minefield when he steps on one. "Your daughter-in-law, Beatrice. I had no idea. The agency handled the lease through her legal representatives. We never crossed the last names. And since you demand strict anonymity on your properties..." "My God, are you sure about what you're asking me?" "Absolutely sure," I replied, my voice sounding flat, cold, and devoid of any emotion. "I want the unilateral termination process initiated today, immediately, for direct and irrevocable necessity of the owner." Gomez sighed, rubbing his chin with a look of genuine concern. "Beatrice, listen to me as your lawyer. That clause exists for extreme emergencies. If you invoke it now, without any breach of payment on her end, the financial penalty you will have to pay for breaking a 5-year lease is brutal. We are talking about compensation for damages, a full return of the security deposit, plus relocation costs that her lawyers will undoubtedly demand. It's a fortune." I didn't blink. I reached into my purse for the second time. I pulled out my personal checkbook and a black ink pen. I uncapped it with a sharp click that echoed in the silence of the office. "Tell me the exact figure, Arthur. The absolute maximum, including your fees for the rush job. Beatrice, please think this through. It's a lot of money thrown in the trash just because..." "Arthur," I cut him off, locking my eyes onto his with an intensity that made him go quiet on the spot. "Money doesn't feel pain. It doesn't cry, and it doesn't humiliate itself in expensive restaurants. Money is a tool, and today that tool is going to buy my absolute peace of mind and the disinfection of my property. Tell me the figure." The lawyer swallowed hard, nodded slowly, and typed something into his computer for a couple of minutes. He scribbled a number on a sticky note and slid it toward me. It was an obscene amount, enough to buy a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. Without hesitating for a single second, I wrote the amount on the check, signed it with firm, precise strokes, and handed it to him. "The funds will be cleared in the agency's escrow account in less than 2 hours," I informed him, putting my checkbook away. "Now tell me the legal timeline." Gomez looked at the check, still in disbelief, then adopted his most professional posture, realizing there was no turning back. "With this financial backing, I will draft the formal notice of immediate eviction today. A notary public will certify it by noon. First thing tomorrow morning, a legal courier will hand-deliver the document to the clinic. From the moment she signs the receipt, she will have exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises entirely. If she doesn't, on Monday morning, we will send law enforcement to shut the place down and haul her equipment out to the street." "Perfect." 72 hours, I repeated, feeling a deep, dark satisfaction taking root in my chest. "Make sure the document bears my full name in large print, Arthur. I want there to be not the slightest sliver of doubt about who owns the floor she walks on." I stood up, grabbed my purse, and headed for the door. Beatrice Gomez called out before I could leave. "I don't know what that woman did to you, but I assure you, I wouldn't want to be in her shoes when she opens that envelope tomorrow. Believe me, Arthur, her shoes are entirely too vulgar for me." Anyway, I walked out of the corporate building feeling 20 pounds lighter. The clock barely read 9:30 in the morning. I could have gone back home, made lunch, and waited patiently for the legal machinery to crush Stephanie's cardboard empire the next day. But my methodical nature required a final inspection of the terrain. I wanted to see the exact level of arrogance my daughter-in-law was operating at right before the fall. I wanted to look the woman who had humiliated me dead in the eye, and know with absolute certainty that her punishment was proportional to her cruelty. I hailed another cab and asked to be taken to the Elm Street Commercial Center. The place was a monument to unchecked consumerism. Pristine glass facades, international brand stores, and security guards in dark suits patrolling the marble hallways. I walked at a leisurely pace, taking in the window displays until I reached the north wing, where Suite 12 was located. It was massive. It occupied a prime corner spot featuring 2 floors connected by a glass spiral staircase. The gold lettering above the main door gleamed under the halogen lights. Stephanie's Spa and VIP Aesthetics Clinic. Before approaching the entrance, I spotted an older man in the gray maintenance uniform of the mall, polishing the brass trim of a nearby trash can. It was Manuel. He had been working in that building for 20 years, long before it became a luxury outdoor mall. He was one of only 3 people in the entire complex who knew I was the majority owner of the place. I walked up to him quietly. When he looked up and recognized me, his tired eyes lit up, and he hurried to take off his cap in respect. "Miss Beatrice, what a miracle seeing you around here. I thought you never came down to inspect the building in person anymore." "Hello, Manuel. I was just passing through, taking care of some business." I smiled at him, a genuine smile I reserved only for hard-working, honest people. "How is your wife? Still having trouble with her knee?" "She's hanging in there, Miss Beatrice, fighting through it with the meds. You know how it is getting old, but I'm not complaining. We have work." His gaze darted for a second toward the imposing glass facade of Stephanie's clinic, and his expression hardened, twisting into a grimace of deep disgust. I noticed the shift immediately. "Problems with the new tenants in Suite 12, Manuel?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. The old worker let out a sigh of frustration and looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Oh, Miss Beatrice, if you only knew. That woman who rented the place is an absolute demon. She's been setting up shop here for less than a month, and she's already made 3 of the cleaning girls cry. She screams at them over any little nonsense, says we're useless, that our work isn't up to the standards of her exclusive clientele. Just yesterday, she caused a huge scene in the hallway because the AC in her reception area took 5 minutes to cool down. She treated me like I was garbage, Miss Beatrice. Pardon my language, but she is a wicked woman, rotten on the inside. Hearing the confirmation of Stephanie's toxic nature from the mouth of a man as noble as Manuel solidified my decision even further. I wasn't just avenging my own humiliation. I was cleansing my building of a plague. I placed a gentle hand on Manuel's shoulder and looked him squarely in the eyes. Have a little patience, Manuel. I promise you the AC problem in Suite 12 is going to be resolved very soon. In fact, I assure you that in a few short days, that space will be colder and emptier than a graveyard. Manuel looked at me confused for a moment, but seeing the icy hardness in my eyes, he nodded slowly, understanding that something massive was in motion. Whatever you say, Miss Beatrice, you always know what you're doing. I said goodbye to him and walked straight toward the double-glass doors of the clinic. As I pushed them open, a silver bell announced my arrival. The interior was an obscene display of poorly spent money. White velvet sofas, pastel-painted walls, live orchids in every corner, and a quartz front desk where a young receptionist looked at me with disdain upon seeing my simple clothes. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" the girl asked, chewing gum in a highly unprofessional manner. Before I could answer, I heard the unmistakable sound of stiletto heels clicking against the marble floor. Stephanie emerged from the back hallway. She was wearing a perfectly tailored white silk medical coat and holding an electronic tablet in her hand. Seeing me standing in the middle of her brand new reception area, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her face transitioned from initial shock to a look of blatant, unabashed triumph. Evidently, in her twisted mind, my presence there could only mean one thing: submission. She thought I had come to apologize for the tension at dinner, to beg for peace so I wouldn't lose my son, to grovel before her velvet throne. Well, well. Look who decided to crawl out of her cave of dust and old books, Stephanie said, approaching with slow feline steps, crossing her arms in front of me. What are you doing here, Beatrice? Did Sebastian force you to come apologize for your uncooperative attitude last night? I kept my face expressionless. I surveyed the laser machines parked in the adjacent rooms, the gigantic mirrors, the chandeliers, all paid on credit, all dependent on this exact space. I was in the neighborhood, Stephanie. I thought it would be appropriate to see the place where my son has invested so much money and effort. I replied in a neutral, measured tone. Stephanie let out a dry, dismissive laugh that echoed perfectly in the acoustics of the room. The receptionist lowered her head, pretending to look at her computer, but hanging on every word. Your son, please, Beatrice. Sebastian just co-signed a couple of meaningless papers. This empire is mine. I built it, I designed it, and I run it. And let me make something very clear to you, since you had the audacity to come all the way down here. She took a step toward me, invading my personal space, lowering her voice into a venomous hiss. Last night at the restaurant was just a small sample. The rules of this family have changed. I am the priority. Now you and that sick husband of yours are ancient history. You better get used to eating your soup in silence and keeping your opinions to yourself. Because if you provoke me, I swear to you, you will never see Sebastian again for the rest of your life. I didn't step back a single millimeter. I endured her breath smelling of expensive coffee and mint. I endured her gaze loaded with unjustified hatred. I felt the anger boiling in my veins, but my intellectual, methodical mind kept it locked away. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a screaming match. "It is a very beautiful space, Stephanie. Very spacious," I said, suddenly changing the subject with a naturalness that completely threw her off balance. I swept my gaze across the high ceiling, feigning admiration. It must have cost a fortune to build out. She blinked, confused by my lack of reaction to her threat, but her vanity won out over her intelligence. She smirked, caressing the surface of the quartz desk. An absolute fortune. We knocked down walls, changed the entire plumbing system, imported the flooring from Italy. But it was worth every penny. I have an ironclad 5-year lease. This place is my fortress, Beatrice. Nobody can take it from me. Nobody. I nodded slowly, absorbing every single one of her words, filing them away in my memory to savor later. 5 years is a long time. Things can change from one day to the next in the business world, Stephanie. You must always be prepared for contingencies. Contingencies are for losers who don't know how to plan mother-in-law. I have everything under absolute control, she snapped, turning her back on me with pure contempt and walking toward the hallway. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have VIP clients to attend to, and I don't want your presence depressing the vibe of my clinic. You know the way out. I watched her strut away in her heels, feeling like the absolute master of the universe. I didn't say another word. I turned around and walked out the glass doors, letting the little bell chime one last time behind my back. Stepping out into the mall concourse, the fresh air filled my lungs. A minuscule smile, sharp and cold, finally formed on my lips. Her arrogance was monumental, but her ignorance was even greater. She hadn't read Clause 4. She had spent millions remodeling a space she didn't own, blindly trusting a standard contract my agency specifically designed to protect my interests against any unforeseen event. As I walked toward the mall exit, my cell phone vibrated in the pocket of my trench coat. I pulled it out and checked the screen. It was Sebastian. I let it ring 3 times before picking up. "Hello," I said, my voice dropping back to its usual dry tone. "Mom, hey." My son's voice sounded small, fearful, heavy with cowardly guilt. "Mom, I wanted to talk about last night. I know Stephanie was a little out of line. She's just really stressed about the clinic opening. The financial pressure has her on edge. She didn't mean any harm by it." I closed my eyes for a second, feeling a pang of genuine pain in my chest. My son. The brilliant architect, reduced to playing defense attorney for an abuser. "Do not call me to justify disrespect, Sebastian," I interrupted, my voice slicing through his excuses like a scalpel. A stressed woman yells or cries. A cruel woman humiliates her husband's mother in front of strangers. There is no possible confusion between the two. "Mom, please try to understand." "I understand perfectly, Sebastian. I understand everything with terrifying clarity. You took your stance last night by staying quiet. I respect your decision not to intervene. Now I demand that you respect mine, your decision." "What do you mean, Mom? What are you going to do?" The sudden panic in his voice was palpable. He knew I didn't make empty threats. "I am going to move on with my life, Sebastian, exactly as I should. Say hello to your wife for me." I hung up the phone before he could stammer out another word. I powered the device off completely and dropped it into the bottom of my purse. There was no more room for negotiations or late apologies or tears of regret. I stepped out onto the street just as the drizzle began to fall over the city again. I raised my hand to hail another cab. As I waited on the curb, a text message from Arthur Gomez lit up the black screen of my phone, before it finished powering down. I read it quickly. Document notarized and sealed. Courier is instructed to deliver tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp. The clock starts ticking the second she signs. I put the phone away for good. The process was in motion. The trap had snapped shut. Now the only thing left to do was sit back, eat my soup in peace, and watch as Stephanie's perfect world collapsed under the crushing weight of her own stupidity. The rest of the afternoon passed with the deliberate monotony I always enforce in my home when an external storm is about to break. I got home shortly before 1 in the afternoon. The smell of beef and rosemary stew filled the main hallway. Mrs. Rosa, the stoic woman who has helped us with the housework for 15 years, had left lunch simmering on the stove before heading out for the weekend. I hung my damp trench coat on the mahogany coat rack in the entryway, aligning the edge of the dark fabric perfectly with the carved wood. Precision in small daily details is the only thing standing between us and absolute chaos. A lesson I learned cataloging thousands of university books, and one I was now applying to the demolition of my daughter-in-law's ego. I found Arthur sitting in his recliner by the living room window, a plaid wool blanket draped over his legs. He was holding a half-finished crossword puzzle book, but his gaze was lost in the raindrops sliding down the glass. Hearing my footsteps on the hardwood floor, he turned his head slowly. The tension in his jaw was obvious, a map of deep wrinkles etched by the anxiety of knowing I had gone out to light a fuse that could not be extinguished. "Is it done?" my husband asked, his voice echoing fragilely in the large room. "Lunch is almost ready, Arthur. I'll serve you in the dining room," I replied, ignoring his question with the same clinical neutrality a doctor uses to ignore a patient's groans while adjusting a necessary bandage. There was no need to overwhelm him with the operational details of the law firm, nor with the obscene figure I had just paid to expedite the eviction process. He only needed to know the house was in order. I walked into the kitchen and turned the burner to low under the cast iron pot. As the stew bubbled, I pulled 2 deep bowls from the cupboard. The irony of the situation did not escape my methodical intellect. Stephanie had decreed in front of that pretentious restaurant that toothless old people only eat soup. I lacked neither literal nor metaphorical teeth, but I had discovered that liquid food had its advantages. It requires no effort to chew, leaving the mind completely free to calculate the exact angle at which you will slide the knife into someone's back. I served the thick, dark broth, making sure to place the tenderest chunks of beef in Arthur's bowl, and carried the food to the dining room. We ate in a dense silence, broken only by the metallic clinking of silverware against porcelain. Arthur watched me out of the corner of his eye, searching for a crack in my expression, any trace of doubt or regret. He found absolutely nothing. My face was a plaster mask. When we finished, I cleared the plates, methodically washed them with hot water and soap, dried each one with a clean cotton cloth, and put them away in their exact place. The physical routine provided an excellent anchor. At 4 in the afternoon, I locked myself in my study. The daylight was beginning to fade, tinted by the gray clouds that refused to leave the city. I turned on the green brass lamp on my desk and pulled a worn leather folder from the bottom drawer, one I hadn't opened in years. It contained the original architectural blueprints for the Elm Street commercial building, hand-drawn by the architect my father hired in 1978. I unrolled the yellowed paper over the polished wood. I ran the pad of my index finger over the blue ink lines outlining Suite 12. It was fascinating to observe the anatomy of the trap. My father had conceived that space as a bank vault with reinforced walls and hidden piping under a false floor. Stephanie had spent a fortune covering those walls with pastel paint and imported mirrors, entirely oblivious to the foundational structure she was walking on. She believed she owned the space because she had hung chandeliers from the ceiling. It was the same absurd logic of a parasite believing it owns the dog, simply because it found a comfortable spot behind its ear. The house landline rang twice during the afternoon. I stared at the caller ID screen with clinical detachment. It was Sebastian. I didn't pick up the receiver. There was nothing my son could say to alter the trajectory of the projectile that had already been fired. His retrospective panic was useless. If he had shown a fraction of that same panic when his wife ripped the menu from my hands, none of this would be happening. I let the answering machine absorb the sound of his empty pleas. His recorded voice sounded high, almost childish, begging me to call him back to clear things up like adults. I turned the machine's volume all the way down. Adult clarity would arrive tomorrow at 9 in the morning, delivered in a manila envelope by a notary public. Night fell heavy and cold. I put Arthur to bed early, making sure he took his blood pressure medication. I sat on the edge of the bed until his breathing turned deep and rhythmic. Then, I moved to my own side of the mattress, but sleep kept a safe distance. My mind ran through the schedules, the clauses, the possible reactions. I didn't feel anxiety, but an icy anticipation, similar to what an engineer must feel watching the countdown for the controlled demolition of a ruined building. Sunday dawned with a clear sky, a pale, biting blue that washed the streets clean after the storm. I got up at 6 in the morning with clockwork precision. The delivery of the document was scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp the following morning, Monday. But Arthur Gomez's real estate agency had a special courier service that operated on weekends for extreme emergencies. I had paid triple for that exception. The notary would deliver the notice today, Sunday, the busiest day at the mall, the day Stephanie had scheduled an exclusive breakfast at her clinic for her wealthiest clients. The stage was simply too perfect to pass up. I dressed in a navy blue wool-tailored suit, an immaculate white silk blouse, and my low-heeled shoes. I applied a discreet lipstick and pulled my silver hair back into a tight bun at the nape of my neck. I wasn't dressing up for her. I was dressing up for the event. I prepped Arthur's breakfast, left a note on his nightstand saying I had gone out for coffee, and left the house before he woke up. I took a cab to the mall. I arrived at 8:30 in the morning. The main doors had just opened to the public, and the marble corridors were relatively quiet, occupied only by hurried employees and early birds. I walked with a steady pace toward the north wing, but I didn't approach Suite 12. Instead, I rode the escalator up to the second floor. Right above Stephanie's clinic, on an indoor terrace overlooking the lower level, sat High Ground Cafe, an elegant establishment owned by Helen, a woman my age with whom I shared a taste for classic literature and unsweetened black tea. Helen was behind the pastry display, arranging trays of freshly baked croissants. Seeing me, her eyes lit up with genuine surprise. "Beatrice, what a miracle! Seeing you so early on a Sunday. I thought your weekends were strictly dedicated to your garden and Arthur," she said, wiping her hands on a pristine linen apron. "There are exceptions to every rule, Helen. I needed to get out and breathe some fresh air, or, in this case, filtered air conditioning," I replied with a tight smile. "Do you have that table open by the glass railing? The one looking right down at the lower concourse?" Helen nodded, noting the unusually focused tone in my voice. "Of course, I'll save it for you. Should I bring you the usual?" I hesitated, feeling the dry irony of the situation spark a deep satisfaction within me. "Today, I want soup. A piping hot chicken broth served in your best bowl." Helen raised an eyebrow, clearly bewildered by my request at 8:30 in the morning. But her professionalism kept her from asking questions. "Soup it is. I'll bring it out in 5 minutes. I sat in the cushioned wicker chair, set my purse on the adjacent table, and looked down through the thick tempered glass railing. The view was perfect. I had a complete, unobstructed panorama of the glass facade of Stephanie's Spa and VIP Aesthetics Clinic. From my elevated position, the place looked like an absurd, pretentious dollhouse. The halogen lights shined brightly, illuminating the white velvet sofas and the ridiculously expensive orchids. At 8:45, Stephanie appeared in my line of sight. She came walking down the lower concourse with that arrogant strut she mistook for elegance. She was wearing a tight designer dress and stiletto heels that echoed like hammer strikes against the marble. She was accompanied by two other women dressed just as ostentatiously, chatting animatedly, and laughing out loud. The exclusive breakfast was about to begin. I watched the receptionist open the double doors for them with an almost servile bow. Stephanie walked into her domain, gesturing at the walls, showing off her paper kingdom to her guests. Helen arrived with my order. She placed the steaming bowl of chicken broth in front of me, accompanied by a gleaming silver spoon and a cloth napkin. Here you go, Beatrice. If you need anything else, just raise your hand. This is absolutely perfect, Helen. Thank you, I murmured, without taking my eyes off the stage unfolding on the floor below. I picked up the spoon, sank the metal into the hot liquid, and took the first sip. The taste was comforting, salty, and rich. Toothless old people only eat soup. I chewed a small piece of boiled carrot with my perfectly healthy teeth and checked my wristwatch. It was 3 minutes to 9. At 8:58, a man dressed in a dark gray suit, carrying a black leather briefcase, walked into the North Wing corridor. He didn't walk with the rush of a shopper or the distraction of a window browser. He walked with the relentless precision of legal machinery. It was the notary courier from Gomez's firm. I recognized the gold logo of the notary office discreetly embroidered on his jacket lapel. The man stopped in front of the clinic's glass doors. He checked a piece of paper in his hand, verified the suite number on the gold sign, and pushed the door open. The silver bell chimed, a faint sound that barely reached my position on the second floor, but in my mind, it rang out like the tolling of a funeral bell. I placed the spoon down on the saucer. I leaned forward, slightly resting my forearms on the glass railing, refusing to blink, so I wouldn't miss a single millisecond of the execution. Through the clinic's massive front window, I could clearly see the courier approach the court's desk. The receptionist spoke to him, probably trying to shoo him away, indicating there was a private event. The man didn't back down. He popped open his leather briefcase with a sharp snap, pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax, and placed it on the counter. He spoke words I obviously couldn't hear, but his body language was unmistakable, absolute, non-negotiable authority. The receptionist turned pale and picked up her desk phone with trembling hands. Seconds later, Stephanie emerged from the adjacent room, interrupting her breakfast with the VIP clients. Her face displayed clear irritation at being interrupted. She marched toward the front desk with fast, furious steps, ready to annihilate the intruder who dared stain the aesthetics of her perfect morning. I watched Stephanie plant herself in front of the notary courier, crossing her arms, her lips moving rapidly, undoubtedly unleashing one of her usual cascades of arrogance. The courier didn't flinch. He simply pointed at the manila envelope and slid a receipt of delivery and a pen across the counter. Stephanie let out a dismissive laugh, grabbed the pen furiously, and signed the paper with an aggressive stroke, likely assuming it was some meaningless municipal fine or an administrative error her lawyers would tear apart on Monday. The courier took his receipt, offered a brief nod, and walked out of the suite. The clock on the mall's central tower struck 9 o'clock sharp. The timer had started. 72 hours. I took another sip of my soup, savoring the broth with almost liturgical slowness. Stephanie remained standing by the front desk. With a gesture of disdain, she broke the red wax seal on the manila envelope. She pulled out the thick, stapled legal document. I watched her flip open the pages abruptly. Her two VIP friends had walked up to the counter, watching her curiously holding crystal flutes of mimosas. The process of human comprehension is fascinating when observed from the proper distance. First, Stephanie's eyes quickly scanned the first paragraph. Her arrogant posture remained intact. Then her eyes dropped to the center of the page, where the unilateral termination clause was printed in bold. I saw her shoulders tense slightly. Finally, her gaze reached the last line of the first page. The space reserved for the legal property owner's details, written in unmistakable capital letters. Beatrice Navarro. The transformation was absolute and instantaneous. It was like watching a glass building collapse on its own foundation in slow motion. The color drained entirely from Stephanie's face, leaving her skin a sickly ashen gray. Her hands began to shake so violently that the pages of the contract made a dull flapping sound as they hit against each other. She took a step back, stumbling clumsily on her own designer heels, and had to grab the court's desk with one hand to keep from hitting the floor. The receptionist jumped up in alarm. Stephanie's friends set their glasses down and rushed to her, touching her arm, asking what was wrong. Stephanie couldn't answer. Her mouth opened and closed without making a sound, like a fish pulled from the water and tossed onto the scorching pavement. She read page 2, then page 3. Pure, raw panic warped her features. The monumental arrogance she had displayed at the restaurant and the day before had evaporated, replaced by the absolute terror of a woman who had just realized the abyss she was dancing over had no bottom. From my table on the second floor, I lifted my teacup in an almost imperceptible motion, silently toasting the marvelous efficiency of the legal system, and took a long sip. Irony was a delicacy that required no chewing. Suddenly, Stephanie snatched her cell phone off the counter with frantic fingers. She began dialing a number desperately. A second later, my own cell phone vibrated deep inside my leather purse. I pulled it out slowly. The illuminated screen displayed my daughter-in-law's name. I let it vibrate on the wicker table, watching the screen flash. And then I looked down. Stephanie had the device pressed to her ear, pacing in circles around the reception area, her face unhinged by hysteria. I didn't answer. I rejected the call with a soft tap of my index finger. Down below, Stephanie pulled the phone away from her face upon hearing the rejection tone. She threw the device onto the white velvet sofa with a scream of frustration that I could guess by the brutal flexing of her neck muscles. Her VIP friends backed away, startled by the sudden outburst of violence. My phone vibrated again. This time it was Sebastian, of course. She had called her husband the cosigner for all her loans, the man who let his mother be humiliated. I answered on the third ring, keeping my voice low, measured, and clinically neutral. "Good morning, Sebastian. What a pleasant surprise to hear from you on a Sunday morning," I said, tearing off a piece of rustic bread with my free hand. Mom, for God's sake, tell me this is a mistake." My son's voice was an absolute shriek of panic, high-pitched and desperate. Stephanie just called me, crying hysterically. She says a notary handed her an eviction notice, that the clinic— Mom, she says the property is in your name. Tell me it's a mix-up with the real estate agency. I took a moment before answering. I chewed the bread slowly, feeling the crusty texture crumble in my mouth. There is no mix-up, Sebastian. The documentation is flawless. The building was an inheritance from your maternal grandfather. I have always managed it very discreetly. But it's Stephanie's space. We signed a 5-year lease, Mom. We invested our entire life savings there. The bank loans the machinery. They're going to ruin us if they kick us out now. The panic in his voice was morphing into choked sobs. Hearing my own son fall apart like that caused a sharp stab in my chest. but my willpower was cast iron. I hadn't created the situation. I was merely executing the consequences. The lease has a termination clause for direct owner necessity, Sebastian. Clause 4, Section B. Your wife signed it. Her lawyer reviewed it. If they didn't read what they were signing before spending money they didn't have, that demonstrates gross financial negligence, not an injustice on my part. Mom, I'm begging you. You can't do this to us. It's your family. Stephanie is destroyed. She says they have 72 hours. It's impossible to move that equipment in 3 days. They're going to repossess everything I looked down. Stephanie was now sitting on the marble floor of her brand new clinic, head in her hands, designer dress bunched under her knees, sobbing inconsolably in front of her guests and her employee. The picture of total defeat. Ah, the timeline, I murmured with terrifying calm. Yes, the notary notice is quite clear on that point. You have exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises completely. If the laser machines are still there by Wednesday at 9 in the morning, law enforcement will put them on the sidewalk of the main avenue. If I were you, I'd start looking for moving trucks instead of wasting time calling me. Please, Mom, forgive me. Forgive us. I know the restaurant thing was wrong. I swear I'll make her get on her knees and beg for your forgiveness, if I have to, but stop the eviction. The silence I let drop over the phone line was thick, heavy, loaded with the weight of 40 years of hard work and non-negotiable dignity. Sebastian, I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing any trace of maternal warmth, transforming into the voice of the ruthless landlord. An apology demanded under the threat of financial ruin holds zero moral value. And regarding the restaurant, I took a deliberate pause, picking up my spoon and stirring the dark liquid in my bowl. I believe I heard your wife say that toothless old people only eat soup and have no right to choose anything. It turns out I chose to execute Clause 4 on my property. And by pure coincidence, I am eating a delicious soup right now. I suggest you tell your wife to start looking up cheap broth recipes. She's going to need them when she has to pay back the bank loans without having a place to operate. I didn't wait for his answer. I ended the call and powered off the phone completely. Down below, the scene had reached a level of pathos that was no longer interesting to observe. The VIP clients were hurriedly leaving the clinic, uncomfortable with the embarrassing spectacle. Sidestepping Stephanie, who was still sobbing on the floor, her running makeup staining her cheeks black. Her empire of illusions and bank credit had been eradicated with a simple signature on a piece of paper. The very same paper she had despised for belonging to a bitter old recluse. I finished my soup down to the last drop. I wiped my lips with a cloth napkin. I stood up and left a generous tip on the table for Helen. It was excellent, Helen. Exactly what I needed to start the day, I told my friend as I walked past the counter. I'm glad you liked it, Beatrice. You have a very clear look in your eye today, like you've had a huge weight lifted off your shoulders. You have no idea how much, Helen. You have no idea how much. I left the cafe and walked toward the escalator, turning my back on the north wing of the mall. The first blow had landed with devastating precision, stripping the fragility of her lies bare in front of her own witnesses. But the legal process was cold and impersonal, and I knew perfectly well that Stephanie, in her desperation and chronic narcissism, would not accept defeat in silence. She would try to fight. She would try to use my son as a human shield. She would try to show up at my house to stage one last, pathetic, theatrical display of victimhood. And when she did, when she came crawling looking for pity, I would be sitting in my reading chair with a book on my lap, ready to slam the iron vault door shut once and for all. The machinery could no longer be stopped, and I had all the time in the world to watch the gears finish their work. The cab ride back to my house in the residential zone was accompanied by a restorative silence, broken only by the constant hum of tires on wet asphalt. The city, that hours before had seemed like a hostile maze of neon lights and unchecked arrogance, now unfolded before my eyes like a perfectly ordered chessboard. I had moved my main piece. Checkmate was declared. I watched through the window as the gray clouds began to dissipate, allowing timid rays of midday sun to illuminate the sidewalks. My breathing was steady, rhythmic, lacking that anxious tachycardia that usually accompanies vulgar confrontations. My revenge was not an act of uncontrolled passion. It was an administrative procedure executed with the surgical precision I had been taught during my 40 years among university archives. Crossing the threshold of my home, the scent of polished wood and beef stew welcomed me like a familiar embrace. I hung my purse on the coat rack in the foyer with methodical movements. I knew the peace of my house was on borrowed time. Stephanie and Sebastian wouldn't take long to show up. Desperation is a highly predictable fuel, and financial panic is the greatest accelerant for people who have built their identity on a mountain of debt. I walked into the living room. Arthur was exactly where I had left him, sitting in his recliner. But now he was holding an empty teacup and staring blankly at the front door, as if he could see right through the solid wood. The tension in his shoulders gave away that he had been waiting for my return, with a mix of dread and anticipation. I walked up to him, gently took the empty cup from his trembling hands, and set it on the coffee table. I sat on the sofa across from him, smoothing the skirt of my navy blue wool suit. "The document was delivered at 9 o'clock sharp, Arthur," I reported, my voice sounding as calm as if I were giving the weather forecast. "The 72-hour clock is already ticking. Sebastian called me a little while ago. He was out of his mind. I made it very clear to him that there is no turning back." Arthur closed his eyes for a long moment, absorbing the weight of my words. His hand, marked by bulging veins and arthritis, rubbed the bridge of his nose. "They're going to come, Bia. You know they're going to come here, to beg, to scream, to demand answers. Sebastian isn't going to accept losing his entire net worth without putting up a fight. And that woman is capable of any low blow when she feels cornered. I am counting on it, my old man. I am counting on exactly that," I replied, standing up. "But we are not going to receive this storm unarmed. Words are carried away by the wind, and Stephanie is an expert at manipulating narratives to play the victim. We need an anchor to reality." I walked over to the landline, resting on the small mahogany table in the hallway. I dialed Arthur Gomez's personal number. The lawyer answered on the second ring, his voice professional and alert. "Beatrice, I assume the courier did his job. The system notified me of the signed receipt almost an hour ago." "That's right, Arthur. The impact was exactly as expected. But I'm calling you because I need one final favor from you. One that goes beyond the scope of your office. I want you to come to my house immediately. Bring a certified copy of the lease agreement, the exact breakdown of the financial penalties my daughter-in-law will have to assume for the termination, and your presence as my legal representative. They are going to come here to put on a show, and I want a qualified, impartial witness to document every threat and dismantle every single one of their financial lies with the law in hand." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Gomez was a prudent man, but he was also intensely loyal to my family. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Beatrice. I'll prepare the file. Don't worry. I won't let them intimidate you in your own home." I hung up the phone and dedicated myself to setting the stage. The physical layout of a space is critical for controlling the power dynamic in any meeting. I slightly shifted the heavy oak coffee table so it sat exactly between the sofas, creating an impassable physical barrier. I went to my study, opened my desk drawer, and pulled out a small digital voice recorder I used to use for dictating memos at the university. I made sure it had fresh batteries and discreetly tucked it behind a silver frame holding an old photograph of Arthur and me right on the fireplace mantel. I was not going to allow anyone to distort what would be said in this room. Mr. Gomez arrived exactly 21 minutes later. He was wearing his impeccable gray suit and carrying a dark leather briefcase that looked like it weighed a ton. I brought him into the living room. He greeted Arthur with a respectful handshake and sat in the wingback chair flanking the fireplace, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick, pressed cardboard file. I ran the numbers before leaving the office. Beatrice Gomez said, adjusting his glasses on his nose, "Your daughter-in-law's situation is financially catastrophic. To equip that clinic, she took out 2 commercial loans with variable interest rates, putting up the projected 5-year revenue of the space as collateral. By breaking the lease, the bank has the right to demand full payment of the debt immediately. Furthermore, the medical laser machines don't belong to her. They are under a financing lease that requires them to operate exclusively at the registered address. If she moves them to the street, she commits the crime of misappropriation of assets." I nodded slowly, absorbing every detail with the coldness of a data analyst. "And Sebastian, what is his level of exposure in all this?" Arthur asked, his voice shaking slightly with the paternal worry that refused to die. Gomez sighed, looking down at the documents. "Sebastian signed as a joint guarantor on absolutely everything, Arthur. If she goes bankrupt, the creditors will go straight for Sebastian's salary, his bank accounts, and any property in his name. They are tied hand and foot to the exact same anvil." The sharp, shrill sound of the front doorbell sliced through the air in the room like a blade. It wasn't a polite ring. It was a desperate succession of buzzes accompanied by hard knocks against the solid wood. They had arrived. I looked at Arthur. He nodded slowly, straightening his back in his recliner, finding a reserve of strength deep within his physical frailty. I looked at Gomez, who closed his file and crossed his legs with absolute professional composure. I walked down the hallway with measured steps. I didn't rush. I let them pound on the door 3 more times before turning the brass deadbolt and pulling it open. The image that greeted me on the porch was the perfect portrait of arrogant ruin. Stephanie no longer looked like the untouchable queen from the pretentious restaurant. Her designer dress was wrinkled. Her perfectly straightened hair now looked messy, and the dark makeup around her eyes had run carving gray tracks down her pale cheeks. She was breathing heavily, her hands balled into fists at her sides. Behind her, Sebastian looked like he had aged 10 years in a single morning. He was pale, sweaty, with bloodshot eyes and a look of pure terror that turned my stomach. My own son, reduced to a bundle of nerves because of his own cowardice. "You," Stephanie screamed, taking an aggressive step into my house before I could even say a word. Her voice was a hysterical shriek. "You are a monster, a bitter, disgusting old woman. How dare you do this to me? That clinic is mine." I didn't step back. I maintained my upright posture, blocking the hallway with my presence. "Lower your voice in my house, Stephanie. You are disturbing the peace of my neighborhood. And take your shoes off if you're going to step on my rug. They are covered in mud," I ordered, my tone devoid of any emotion, cold and sharp as ice. Sebastian intervened, quickly grabbing his wife by the arm to stop her advance, looking at me with pleading eyes. "Mom, please let us in. We have to talk. There has to be a logical solution to all of this. I'm begging you." I stepped aside in silence, allowing them entry. They walked down the hallway into the living room. Upon seeing Arthur Gomez sitting comfortably by the fireplace with his documents spread out, they both stopped dead in their tracks. The surprise completely threw them off. They expected to find a lonely old woman they could intimidate, scream at, and emotionally manipulate. Instead, they walked into a private tribunal with Arthur as the silent jury and Mr. Gomez as the legal executioner. "What is this man doing here?" Stephanie demanded, pointing a trembling finger at Gomez. "This is family business. We don't need vulture lawyers sticking their noses in our problems." Gomez didn't even blink at the insult. He adjusted his glasses and looked at her with the same bored expression one might give a pesky insect. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I am here in my capacity as legal representative and estate manager for Mrs. Beatrice Navarro. Any matter regarding Suite 12 of the Elm Street Commercial Center must be discussed in my presence. I suggest you take a seat and watch your language, unless you wish to add a lawsuit for defamation and threats to your already extensive list of legal problems." Stephanie let out a choked sound, a mix of fury and helplessness, and dropped heavily onto the sofa across from us. Sebastian sat next to her, frantically rubbing his hands on the knees of his linen pants. I took my place next to Arthur, keeping the oak table between us as an unnegotiable border. Silence took over the room for a few seconds, thick and suffocating. The tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to echo like a hammer striking an anvil. "Mom," Sebastian began, his voice cracking on the first syllable. "Mom, you have to cancel that eviction notice. Please. We invested everything. We took out massive loans, the machinery, the remodeling, the permits. If you kick us out in 72 hours, you ruin our lives. We will be in absolute bankruptcy. We won't have a place to live." I looked my son in the eyes. I searched them for the hard-working, honest boy I had raised, but I only found a prisoner of his own terrible choices. "The notarized notice is not a suggestion, Sebastian. It is an execution order for a contract you both signed of your own free will. A contract that, as the professionals you claim to be, you should have read before compromising your financial future. The unilateral termination clause for owner necessity is standard in all my commercial leases." "But you don't have any necessity," Stephanie exploded, leaning forward with eyes wide with hatred. "You don't need that space. You're only doing this out of pure malice, because you're jealous of my success, because you can't stand that your son loves me and not you. You are a bitter old woman who wants to destroy our happiness." Arthur slammed his palm against the armrest of his recliner, a sharp crack that startled us all. "Do not speak to my wife that way in her own home," my husband roared, his voice raspy but loaded with an ancient authority I hadn't heard since before his stroke. "You came here looking for mercy, and all you bring is the exact same cheap arrogance you paraded in that restaurant." Stephanie looked at Arthur with contempt, but the lawyer stepped in before she could spit out another vulgarity. "The law does not require the owner to justify her necessity to you," Ma'am Gomez explained, tapping the file with his index finger. "Your signature on page 4 explicitly accepts that the owner can reclaim the property at any time by assuming the corresponding penalties. And let me inform you that Mrs. Navarro has already deposited the full amount owed to you for compensation and security deposit return into the escrow account. Legally, the space is hers. Technically. You are occupying private property at this very second." Stephanie blinked repeatedly, as if Gomez's words were spoken in an alien language. Her brain, accustomed to manipulating through screaming and drama, didn't know how to process a concrete wall of legality. "The compensation money doesn't even cover half of what I owe the bank," she shrieked, grabbing her hair in desperation. "The laser machines cost millions. The bank is going to freeze my accounts on Monday morning if they find out I lost the lease." Gomez nodded with lethal calm. "Correct. And given that Mr. Sebastian is your joint guarantor, the bank will proceed to freeze his accounts as well. They will place a lien on his architecture firm and request the preventive seizure of his personal assets. It is standard procedure in high-risk cases." Sebastian let out a hollow groan and covered his face with both hands. His entire body shook. The house of cards was collapsing on his head in real time, and there was nowhere to hide. "Mom," my son whispered from behind his hands, crying openly. "I'm begging you. I'll do whatever you want. I'll make Stephanie beg for your forgiveness on her knees. We will make a public apology. I'll give you shares in the clinic. Whatever you say. But don't let them destroy me. I am your son." He used that word son like a shield, like a bargaining chip, like a passport to escape the consequences of his actions. My mother's heart bled in silence, but my intellectual mind knew that if I caved now, I would be condemning him to live the rest of his life under the yoke of a woman who despised him as much as she despised me. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees, and locked my gaze directly onto Stephanie's haggard face. "Barely 48 hours ago, Stephanie, you dared to rip a menu right out of my hands in front of a dining room full of strangers." I began, my voice dropping an octave, sounding thick and dangerous in the stillness of the room. "You looked at me with absolute disgust, and you declared with that shrill voice of yours that you are so proud of, that toothless old people only eat soup and have no right to choose anything." She swallowed loudly. The terror in her eyes was now absolute and crystalline. She was realizing that this monumental disaster wasn't a twist of fate. It was a symmetrical execution designed exclusively for her. It was a bad joke, Beatrice. I was really stressed out. I didn't know what I was saying," she stammered, her voice reduced to a pathetic whisper, trying to press back into the sofa as if she wanted to melt into the upholstery. "It was not a joke," I interrupted, slicing through her excuse with precision. "It was a power play. You wanted to humiliate me in front of my son, to establish dominance. You thought that because I am older, because I dress simply and keep a low profile, I was an easy target. A decrepit old woman, as you told your husband, incapable of fighting back. You assumed my silence in that restaurant was weakness, but you were wrong. My silence was simply the time I needed to organize the paperwork for my real estate." I stood up slowly, forcing her to look up at me. "You decreed that I could not choose anything, Stephanie. Well, I have chosen. I have chosen to evict you from my building. I have chosen for the aesthetics empire you bragged so much about to turn to dust before it even opens its doors to the public. And I have chosen to do it using the exact same legal rules you accepted out of pure, blind arrogance." Sebastian raised his head, his face bathed in tears, and looked at his wife with an expression that mixed horror with a belated revelation. "You caused this, Stephanie," Sebastian muttered, his voice trembling with rage. "You provoked my mother. I asked you 1,000 times to be nice, to behave, but you couldn't help your own arrogance. You ruined us, over a damn whim to humiliate her in public. You destroyed our lives." Stephanie snapped her head toward him, her expression instantly shifting from a terrified victim to a cornered beast. The survival instinct of toxic people always involves blaming their closest ally. "Don't you dare blame this on me, you useless piece of trash," she screamed at him, pounding Sebastian's chest with a closed fist. "You are the coward who didn't know how to defend me. If you were a real man, you would demand that this old witch stop this madness. But you're just a mommy's boy, a mediocre architect who needs his little wife to get him connections." The fracture was total. The mask of the perfect marriage built on appearances and bank credit had shattered to pieces in the middle of my living room. They screamed venomous insults at each other, dredging up old resentments, unpaid bills, and personal failures right in front of Arthur Gomez and me. I observed the verbal carnage with clinical detachment. It was painful to see my son in that state, but it was the only way to excise the tumor. Gomez cleared his throat loudly, slamming his files shut. The sharp sound managed to silence the couple's screaming for a moment. "Enough," the lawyer said, standing up and adjusting his suit jacket. "This meeting is over." "Ma'am, sir, the legal terms are non-negotiable. You have exactly 58 hours left to vacate Suite 12. If you fail to do so, law enforcement will execute the eviction, and the storage costs for your equipment will be added to your debt. Mrs. Navarro has nothing else to discuss with you. I suggest you use the time you have left to hire moving trucks instead of screaming at each other in a house that doesn't belong to you." Sebastian stood up, stumbling like a drunk man. He looked at me one last time. His eyes searched for the unconditional refuge I had offered him for 35 years. But my face remained inscrutable, carved in granite. I loved him, but I was not going to save him from the fire he had helped start. "Get out," I said, pointing at the hallway door with a firm index finger, without my pulse trembling. "And Stephanie? When you go to sign your bankruptcy declaration next week, I suggest you bring a thermos with hot soup. It's excellent for soothing the tension of losing everything." Stephanie let out a hollow scream, a guttural sound that seemed ripped from the bottom of her guts. She jumped up, her face flushed with homicidal rage. She grabbed her designer purse off the sofa and ran toward the front door, shoving Sebastian in the process. "This isn't over, Beatrice," she howled from the threshold, spinning around with eyes wide with madness. "I swear to you, I am going to destroy that place. I am going to rip out the wiring. I am going to smash the glass. I am going to flood the floors. If it's not mine, it won't belong to anyone. I am going to hand you back a pile of rubble." She stormed out, slamming the door so hard the window frames in the living room rattled. Sebastian stood paralyzed in the hallway for a second, looking at me with a mix of shame and total panic before running out after her into the street. Silence returned to the house, but it was a thick silence, loaded with static electricity. Arthur let out a long sigh, resting his head against the back of his recliner, exhausted by the intensity of the confrontation. Mr. Gomez stared at me, briefcase in hand, and frowned with deep professional concern. "Beatrice, that final threat wasn't an empty tantrum. I know the psychological profile of people backed into a corner by million-dollar debts. If she decides to vandalize the internal structure of the building out of revenge during these last 48 hours, the damages could cost you hundreds of thousands in repairs. And insurance might refuse to pay, citing negligence for allowing her access after the eviction notice." I looked toward the closed door, my mind processing the new variable with the speed of a computer processing data. Stephanie believed she had one last card to play, one last way to inflict damage before sinking into the abyss. But she continued to underestimate my capacity for anticipation. "Don't worry about the integrity of the walls, Arthur," I murmured, crossing my arms over my chest and feeling a cold smile, devoid of joy, but full of purpose, slowly form on my lips. "She isn't going to destroy anything, because there is something fundamental about that building that she is completely ignorant of, and I am going to make sure to remind her of it tonight." The grandfather clock struck 3 in the afternoon. The game wasn't over yet, and I was about to snap the final trap shut around her neck. Gomez had witnessed countless family disputes and corporate collapses throughout his career. But the absolute tranquility with which I had received the threat of total destruction from my daughter-in-law seemed to throw him off. My husband Arthur watched me from his recliner with wide eyes, waiting for me to reveal the ace up my sleeve. I didn't say a single word right away. I turned around, leaving behind the atmosphere heavy with resentment that Stephanie had left in her wake, and walked with a firm, measured pace down the hall to my personal study. I turned on the green brass lamp on my desk and opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I pulled out the worn leather folder containing the original architectural blueprints for the Elm Street building once again. I returned to the living room and unrolled the massive sheet of yellowed paper over the oak coffee table, right where Gomez had placed his eviction documents minutes before. I ran the pad of my index finger over the master lines drawn in blue ink, tracing the exact perimeter of Suite 12. My father was a man who left absolutely nothing to chance. "Arthur," I began to explain, my voice resonating with the cadence of a university professor delivering an undeniable lecture. When he built this commercial complex in the late 70s, the country was going through a period of tremendous instability. Suite 12, due to its strategic location on the north corner, was not originally designed to house clothing stores or aesthetics clinics. It was specifically designed and built to be the main vault and branch of a national bank. Gomez frowned, adjusting his glasses as he leaned over the blueprints, following the path of my finger. Arthur leaned in too, intrigued by the architectural history lesson. "A bank?" the lawyer muttered, his analytical mind beginning to tie up the loose ends. "But the current facade is tempered glass. It looks completely vulnerable from the outside." "That is just the decorative skin that later management added to modernize the look of the mall," I replied, tapping a cross-section diagram on the bottom margin of the blueprint. Behind those drywall panels that Stephanie painted pastel colors, and hidden in the upper ceiling frames she covered with chandeliers, there are Corten steel security shutters, 2 inches thick. They form a hermetic perimeter. They were designed to withstand vehicle impacts and light explosives. Once those shutters drop, Suite 12 turns into an impenetrable safe. Comprehension lit up Gomez's face. A small smile of amazement and relief formed on his lips. "My God, Beatrice, I have managed your properties for 15 years, and I never knew that security system existed. Does it still work?" "It's been over 40 years. The mechanism is purely mechanical and hydraulic, independent of the building's modern electrical grid," I explained, folding the blueprint with precise movements. "And I make sure it receives covert maintenance every 5 years. The master switch is in the machine room in sub-basement 3, behind a door that only 2 people in this city are authorized to open. I am one of them." I walked over to the hallway landline, picked up the receiver, and dialed the direct number for the mall's maintenance booth. I heard it ring 3 times before a tired but kind voice answered on the other end. "Maintenance, Manuel speaking. How can I help you?" "Good afternoon, Manuel. It's Beatrice Navarro." There was a slight hitch in the old worker's breathing. "Miss Beatrice, what a surprise. Is something wrong at the building?" "Nothing we can't handle, Manuel. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Today, at exactly 6 in the evening, when the mall closes its doors to the public and the concourses are empty, I want you to go down to sub-basement 3. Open the gray panel on the north wall and pull the red lever for the old hydraulic system. Exclusively the lever corresponding to Zone 1, Suite 12. Manuel's silence lasted barely a couple of seconds. As a man who knew the guts of that building better than anyone, he immediately understood the magnitude of the order. "Miss Beatrice, if I pull that lever, the heavy steel shutters are going to completely seal off the aesthetics clinic. Nobody will be able to get in or out, not even with the modern keys. It will be armored from the ceiling down to the floor anchors." "That is exactly the point, Manuel. The current tenant has been served her eviction notice and has made direct threats to vandalize the property and destroy the interior tonight." I want you to protect the asset. Seal the suite at 6 o'clock sharp, and if anyone shows up during the early hours of the morning, trying to force entry or causing a disturbance, do not intervene directly. Call the police immediately and inform them there is an attempted break-in at a sealed private property. Is that clear? Crystal clear, Miss Beatrice, Manuel replied, and I could detect a tone of deep, vindictive satisfaction in his voice. Stephanie had treated him like garbage, and now he was the one dropping the guillotine on her house of cards. At 6 o'clock sharp, that clinic turns into a bunker. Don't worry about a thing. I've got it handled. I hung up the phone and turned to Gomez, who was closing his briefcase with a look of absolute, almost reverent respect. I believe my services will no longer be required for the rest of the day, Beatrice. You have the situation under a level of tactical control that would frighten an army general. I will contact the notary office first thing tomorrow to finalize the eviction paperwork. I walked Mr. Gomez to the door. I thanked him for his loyalty with a firm handshake. When the door closed behind him, the house plunged into a deep silence again. But this time, it wasn't a tense silence. It was the peaceful quiet that follows a storm that has been successfully diverted. I went to the kitchen, made a cup of chamomile tea for Arthur, and sat beside him. We spent the rest of the afternoon reading in the living room, listening to the soft tick-tock of the grandfather clock while the sun slowly set on the horizon, marking the end of Stephanie's empire. The next morning dawned with a clear sky and a freezing chill that invited you to stay under the blankets. I got up at 6 in the morning as my unbreakable routine dictated. I brewed the coffee and toasted the sourdough bread. I was sitting at the dining room table, reading the headlines of the local paper with my reading glasses on, when the landline rang at 8 o'clock sharp. It was the exact time Arthur Gomez started his workday. I picked up the receiver. Good morning, Arthur. I assume you have news regarding the nocturnal events on Elm Street, I said, taking a sip of my black coffee without a hint of anxiety in my tone. On the other end of the line, the lawyer let out a dry laugh, an unusual sound for such a restrained man. News is putting it very mildly, Beatrice. I have the official police report on my desk right this second. The precinct captain is an old friend of the firm, and he sent me a copy first thing. What happened last night was a Dantean spectacle. I settled into my chair, resting my elbow on the wooden table. I'm listening. Don't leave out any details. At 2:15 in the morning, your daughter-in-law showed up in the mall's underground parking garage. She wasn't alone. She brought two individuals who, according to the report, have priors for breaking and entering. They were carrying metal crowbars, sledgehammers, and empty canvas duffel bags. Her intention was clear. Breach Suite 12, trash the facility, smash the mirrors, rip out the plumbing, and haul off any portable equipment of value before the 72-hour window expired. I smiled slightly, picturing the scene. Desperation had pushed her to cross the line from civil insolence straight into criminal territory. But she ran into my father's architecture, I murmured. She ran into a solid steel wall, Gomez confirmed, his voice heavy with retrospective awe. The report states that when they reached the front of the suite, the glass panels were entirely covered by the Corten steel shutters. Stephanie went into a state of total hysteria. She ordered the thugs to beat the steel with the sledgehammers. The noise echoed through the empty building like cathedral bells. Of course, they didn't put a single scratch on the shutters, but the racket was enough for Manuel, who was doing his rounds, to call patrol cars immediately. Gomez paused to take a breath, and I could hear the sound of paper pages flipping. The patrol cars arrived in less than 5 minutes, blocking the garage exits. The two thugs tried to make a run for it, but were intercepted on the ramps. Your daughter-in-law, however, stayed right in front of the suite, beating the steel with her bare hands, screaming obscenities. When the officers tried to calm her down, she physically assaulted a female cop, scratching her face and tearing her uniform. They pinned her to the ground, slapped the cuffs on her, and threw her in the back of the cruiser, right in front of several witnesses and night shift workers from the complex. She spent the night in the holding cells at Central Booking. The coffee in my mouth tasted exceptionally rich this morning. Justice, when executed with patience and precision, has a sweet, unmistakable aftertaste. "And Sebastian?" I asked, feeling a pang of maternal worry that my intellect couldn't entirely silence. Sebastian wasn't with her. According to Stephanie's preliminary statement, he refused to participate in the vandalism. They had a massive blowout at their apartment, and she locked him in, taking his car keys. He found out about the arrest a couple of hours ago when the public defender called him to ask for bail money. But here comes the crucial part, Beatrice. Tell me. Because the attempted vandalism and trespassing were documented by the police, and there is minor damage to the exterior property, the law allows us to immediately cancel the 72-hour grace period for violation of building codes and criminal risk. I've already sent the notification to the bank that financed her equipment. The suite is secured. The bank's repo agents will arrive at noon to seize the laser machines. Your daughter-in-law didn't just lose the clinic. She is now facing criminal charges for assaulting an officer, and her bank debt just became fully due and payable. She's finished, Beatrice. Financially, socially, and legally finished. I thanked Gomez for his flawless execution. I hung up the phone and stood staring out the kitchen window. The sun was shining brightly over the grass in my backyard. I had excised the infection. The process was painful, abrupt, and surgical, but my legacy was safe. And more importantly, my dignity remained intact. I hadn't needed to raise my voice or throw a glass of wine in a restaurant or stoop to the level of hysterical screaming. I only needed a contract, a signature, and a bowl of cold soup to crumble her perfect world. Time has a peculiar way of clearing the rubble when you refuse to live in the past. The months passed with the peaceful slowness of a river returning to its natural course. Autumn painted the trees in my neighborhood in shades of copper and gold, and the routine of my home regained its usual rhythm. Arthur started walking with a little more energy, freed from the toxic stress that Stephanie's presence injected into our family. We never spoke of her. Her name was erased from our daily conversations, with the same efficiency the cleaning crews used to scrub her gold logos off the mall doors. One November afternoon, I decided to take a walk down Elm Street. The crisp air filled my lungs as I strolled through the marble corridors of the commercial complex. The bustle of shoppers was a constant, comforting hum. I rode the escalator up to the second floor and headed toward High Ground Cafe. Helen was behind the display case, as always, arranging the pastry trays. Seeing me, her face lit up with a warm smile. "Beatrice, so good to see you. Come in, sit at your usual table. I'll brew you a black tea right away." I sat by the glass railing, looking down at the lower floor. The massive space that had once been Suite 12 no longer displayed pastel walls or pretentious chandeliers. I had signed a new lease agreement weeks ago this time with a medical foundation that established physical rehabilitation centers for seniors. From my vantage point, I could see the workers finishing the installation of hardwood access ramps and stainless steel handrails. It was a dignified, useful, and quiet purpose for the space my father had built with such care. Helen arrived with my steaming cup of tea and a small plate of butter cookies. She sat in the chair across from me, wiping her hands on her apron with that unmistakable expression of someone holding on to gossip they can't bear to keep to themselves. "You are not going to believe who I saw last week on the south side of town, near the industrial zone." Helen began dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I took a sip of my tea, keeping my expression serene. I am a difficult woman to surprise at this stage in life, Helen, but enlighten me. Stephanie? She said, pronouncing the name with a slight sneer. I went to buy some wholesale supplies for the cafe and walked past one of those cheap beauty salons that charge bargain bin prices for a haircut. She was in there, working as a receptionist and general assistant. She was wearing a faded polyester uniform and sweeping up a floor covered in hair. She tried to hide behind the counter when she saw me walk by, but our eyes met. Her VIP friends, the ones from the exclusive breakfast, wiped themselves off the face of the earth the second the bank repossessed her car and froze her cards. She is completely alone. The arrogance was wiped right off her face, Beatrice. She looked like a ghost. I listened to the description of her downfall without feeling an ounce of pity. But I didn't feel sadistic joy or triumph either. I felt the purest, most absolute indifference. Stephanie had dug her own grave with the shovel of her pride, and now she was forced to sleep in it. People who build their castles on the humiliation of others always end up buried under their own rubble. Helen, I replied calmly, picking up a butter cookie. It is a law of physics as undeniable as gravity. And Sebastian? My friend asked cautiously, knowing it was an emotionally mine territory. I have heard rumors at the bank that he had to file for personal bankruptcy because he co-signed her loans. I stared into the bottom of my teacup, watching the dark leaves settle. Sebastian filed for divorce a month after the incident at the clinic. When he realized Stephanie was planning to leave him with the entire legal burden of the damages and run, he finally woke up from his lethargy. He sold the luxury apartment they shared to try and cover a fraction of the bank debt. He now lives in a rented room in a modest boarding house, working double shifts at an architecture firm, drawing basic blueprints just to pay off the garnishments they take from his paycheck. Helen sighed, feeling the weight of my son's tragedy. That must be very hard for you, Beatrice. A mother never wants to see her son suffer, no matter what mistakes he's made. Have you spoken to him? I looked up and met Helen's eyes. 3 days ago, I received a letter in the mail. A thick blue envelope written in his handwriting. It was covered in postage stamps. It was an apology letter, I assume. An attempt at redemption, now that he has nowhere to go and has lost all his comforts. What did the letter say? I don't know, I replied with a cold, sharp honesty. I didn't open it. I locked it away in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. Forgiveness is not something you demand by mail when you run out of money. Forgiveness is a long process that requires proving with concrete actions that you have changed. If Sebastian manages to rebuild his life, if he proves he has learned the value of dignity and respect, maybe, in a few years, I will pull that letter out and read it. But for now, he has to walk through the desert he chose for himself. I will not be his oasis of convenience. I finished my tea, hugged Helen goodbye, and walked out of the mall. The afternoon wind rustled the leaves on the trees, dragging them across the clean sidewalks. I walked to the taxi stand with my back straight, feeling that every step I took was firmly anchored to the earth. I returned to my house just as the streetlights began to flicker on. Walking in the silence welcomed me like an old friend. Arthur was in the living room, dozing peacefully with a book on his chest. I didn't wake him. I went straight to the kitchen, washed my hands methodically, and put on my cotton apron. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out a thick, beautiful cut of fresh marbled beef. I placed it on the wooden cutting board. I turned on the stove. I heated the cast iron skillet until the metal began to smoke slightly and dropped the meat in. The sizzling sound filled the kitchen, a vibrant, alive, resounding noise. I seasoned the cut with precision, watching the juices caramelize around the edges. While the meat cooked to perfection, I opened the cupboard to pull out a flat porcelain plate. My gaze stopped for a fraction of a second on the bottom shelf. There, stacked in a dark corner, rested the deep ceramic bowls we used for soup. I reached out, took one of the dark bowls, and placed it on the granite countertop right next to my flat plate. I wasn't going to use it to eat. There was no liquid on my menu tonight. But I left it there, empty and clean, under the bright white kitchen light, as a silent reminder of the dinner in that pretentious restaurant. I turned off the heat, plated my steak, cut a firm piece with a sharp knife, and brought it to my mouth. I chewed slowly, savoring the complex texture and the resistance of the meat beneath my perfectly healthy teeth. I looked at the empty bowl beside me, flashed a minuscule smile that required no audience, and continued eating my dinner in the absolute peace of my own kingdom, knowing that no one would ever again tell me what I could or could not choose from my own menu.